Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So we've saved the best, or maybe the worst, for last. I'm not sure which I would call it. But we're concluding our short series we've been rolling here on talking about why the world needs every one of the cognitive functions. So all 8 of the cognitive functions in the Myers-Briggs personality system. And today we're wrapping up the short series with the function that Antonia and I both use as our primary or driver function in our personalities, which is extroverted intuition. And we want to talk about why the world needs this. And I think it was a little bit of, I think we held it to the end because we're so close to it. Sometimes it's hard to, maybe we will toot our own horns too much and prop it up as maybe inflate it as much, more than it's actually should be, or maybe we'll diminish it because it's so much of our function. So we want to approach this in a really accurate and authentic way today as much as possible, but that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, extroverted intuition, we also call it exploration, and I think both of us were thinking about starting this with why the world needs extroverted intuition, and both of us saying something like, it doesn't. All right, we're done. This was a really fast, short podcast. We're out.
Right.
And I think we have a tendency to go the diminishing route more than the overinflate route.
I think so.
Yeah, and I think it's because we experience on a daily basis all of the limitations of this cognitive function because we're swimming in it all the time. And we also love it. I mean, would you be anything other than an ENFP if you could choose?
Heck no.
Yeah.
Heck no. I love being an ENFP at this point.
And I wouldn't choose being anything other than an ENTP.
Yeah.
It's what they call type patriotism in gifts differing. And there's a little bit of type patriotism I think we all have. And so our dominant cognitive function of exploration or extroverted intuition, all of us who are NPs, I mean, even if you're an INP and you're using this as your co-pilot or auxiliary function, it's such a fun, it's like an easy function to fall in love with. It's fun, it's optimistic, people enjoy being around it, and at the same time, it has a bit of a polarizing effect because it can also be obnoxious and annoying and high energy. And the people around you are like, just cool your tits, right? It's going to be fine. Just calm down. And so I think it's an easy one for people to love at a distance. And then it's also one that I think needs some advocacy for, in particular right now, because, okay, so this is my impression. I don't know if I'm right. I say this a lot on the podcast, and I've said it so often that maybe those you listening will have been propagandized into believing this as well because I've said it so many times. But I think that we are in a world right now that's obsessed with novelty. Just how the entire world is constructed right now. We are obsessed with novelty. What's the next new thing? What's the next new app? What's the next new technology? The next new show, the next new movie, the next new person that I'm going to hang out with, right? It's just novelty after novelty after novelty. And novelty is ostensibly in the domain of extroverted intuition. That's what we do as NPs. We love novelty. We love creating new things. We love being inventive. We love trying out stuff that scares other people. And I don't mean in a physical way. I don't mean in an extroverted sensing or sensation way. I mean what's the next idea that scares people? What's the next new trail to blaze? And so because we're a time period that's obsessed with novelty, you would think that the function of extroverted intuition or exploration is overrepresented. But I actually think that the world is obsessed with novelty without being filled with NPs, right? It's not like our numbers, right? Those of us who are NPs. It's not like our numbers went up dramatically. It's not like we all of a sudden tripled in representation. We're still a relatively smaller part of the population demographically. But if you combine SJs and NPs together, and all SJs and NPs will be using extroverted intuition in some capacity. If you combine us together, our numbers are actually quite high because SJs are quite represented in the population. And then, of course, you've got NPs and NJs, or SPs and NJs that don't use this function at all in their 4-function stack or their car model. So most of the world is not using this function well, right? I think if you put all the NPs together, we're not even. I mean, are we a full quarter of the population? Something around that? Not even that.
Yeah.
And so we're 20% maybe. So in a world that's obsessed with novelty, the people who are the stewards of novelty are particularly needed in order to help the world navigate through obsession with novelty. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think the NPs you talk about, or the people making technology and media, have this function a lot. There's a lot of NPs in those two worlds. And the currency of those two worlds is also novelty. I mean, how many times have you seen, at least here in the United States, a car commercial that is boring? It's just so freaking boring. It's done by some ad agency that's super safe. Car commercials are super boring. And then I remember like 10 years ago, these like Kia car commercials started coming out with these like dancing hamsters, these like giant dancing hamsters, and this Kia car and this weird like Korean pop music. And it's like this this is a bizarre commercial because the NPs probably were trying to bust through and do something different in the car commercial world. And obviously, I don't know the sales numbers on that, but it seemed to work enough to where I saw it a lot, to where now I look at advertising everywhere. I think currently right now during the time of this recording, Skittles commercials are this way. Disjointed, random connection, novelty, kind of like absurd there's really no narrative. It's just a bunch of like juxtaposition of things globbed together. And obviously technology is the same way. Like they're always looking for the next new thing to instill in technology to keep pushing that forward. So I think why we're getting this also is media and technology are the things, that's the currency of our time. And novelty is the currency of those two platforms.
Yeah, because the ultimate thing that people are trying to buy or to grab or to take is attention.
Yes.
Like that phrase, we pay attention, right? Like that's a payment we give. Everybody's trying to get attention, right? As a value exchange in some way. And so novelty has become the name of the game in order to jerk attention away from all the other millions of things that you could be paying attention to. And so I think
extroverted intuition does that the best. Like it's the shiny object that just it's like a fishing lure of life. It just, what's that over there? It's so interested in that kind of thing.
Totally. I would say the only function that comes even close to grabbing attention is extroverted sensing, because it just does these really impressive things. It's high energy too. And if you notice, they're both extroverted perceiving functions. Both of them are good at grabbing people's attention. And what's interesting, I think, about what you just mentioned with those car commercials that were really sort of abstract and absurd and dancing hamsters is I remember watching that, wondering if that was actually NPs that put that together, or if it was from people who were trying to mimic the NP style. Somebody who was trying, because here's the thing about that. There wasn't really any cohesiveness to it. There was no pattern. You know what I mean? Like extroverted intuition is about patterns. It's about novelty with pattern recognition.
It's patterned connections, not random connections.
Yeah, exactly. And I think going back to my previous statement, which is that in a world that is novelty obsessed, we need extroverted intuition stewards more than ever, because I think those of us that are immersed in following novelty have gotten pretty good at knowing which things to pay attention to and which to not pay attention to when it comes to novelty. Like we get really good at vetting. Like, okay, I've seen that thing before and I know that's not going anywhere. But I haven't seen that thing before and that's intriguing. Or I haven't seen that thing before, but there's enough markers to it that lets me know that that's not going to go anywhere. So, I mean, I think in terms of like clickbait, it's really rare for me to click on clickbait. I never do it. And not because it's not that the clickbait title didn't work. I mean, I read it and I appreciate it, right? Like I know that is a well-crafted clickbait sentence or subject line. And sometimes I'll even admire it.
What doctors don't want you to know about your gut health.
Yeah, exactly. Or like this one weird trick that blah, 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 blah. You know? So I admire it. What's crazy is other people get mad at clickbait titles. They get frustrated. And I think it's because it draws their attention and they want to click on it. And then when they click on it and there's no substance behind it, they just paid attention. And when they paid their attention out, they didn't get reciprocal value back and it upset them. Whereas when I look at clickbait titles, I kind of get a sense for what is going to have substance behind it, because sometimes there actually is substance. Sometimes there actually is an interesting, decent article behind the clickbait subject line. And I think extroverted intuition probably, I mean, maybe I'm just tuning my own horn here, but I think it kind of gets good at knowing which things to click on and which things not to. Again, because it's pursuing novelty so often. And it's not just pursuing novelty like the rest of the world. It's paying attention to the pursuit of novelty. It's doing it in a way where it's collating all that information and understanding the patterns behind it. I think it gets really good, again, at knowing which novelty to pursue.
I completely agree. As you were talking, I made a little quick little note on my notebook here that extroverted intuition, when it comes to novelty, new things, and connections, and I see this actually from a lot of NP users, right? It's extroverted intuition helps us say no to things, basically. It helps us know what to say no to. Because I see a lot of other ENFPs. I'll be on Twitter or other places, and I'll see ENFPs, and I remember being this way, and I'm still this way in some ways, so I resonate deeply, but I'll see ENFPs frenetic, opening just so many loops, starting so many projects, have their fingers in so many pies, lack of clarity, because every new idea and connection, it's almost like fireworks shooting up out of your head. Like how I imagine almost when you have an extroverted intuitive thought, you shoot this thought up into the sky, and when it explodes over your head, it shoots more like thoughts out from those, and each one of those explodes, and it keeps going. It exponentially grows in the possibilities and the what if scenarios and all the connections it could possibly make with all these ideas. And if you get an extroverted intuitive person, somebody that's using extroverted intuition as a primary or even secondary function in a room brainstorming, often the ideas get more and more complex, bigger and bolder, and more connections, and the complexities start to increase, right? As you get into the brainstorming session. That's what you're supposed to do in a brainstorming session. Allow blue sky thinking, allow thoughts and ideas to ramble, and that can be very useful. And at some point, I think extroverted intuition has to realize there's a limit to that. You know, we have to harness this and go, we got to make some choices here, what we're going to actually attend to, because we can't attend to all of this. I mean, if I tried to follow every new business idea or thought I had, or new podcast for Personality Hacker that comes to my brain, or even your brain, Antonia, the two of us in a room, we would endlessly it would be too much. So we have to be good at pruning and carving down and curating all the novelty, all the connections. It's not connections for connection's sake. It's patterned connections. It's for reasons. It's creating something new out of two connections, not just two things sitting by each other.
And I think there's a distinction between using exploration or extroverted intuition for play and using it as a guiding star in your life. And I think that's why, and you've said this a million times, the highest leverage thing for us here, I mean, Personality Hacker is going to reflect us as people because it's our baby, right? We gave birth to it. And so you've made the motto for Personality Hacker, the highest leverage thing for us is what we say no to, not what we say yes to. And it's because we can say yes to, we have said yes to things in the past. And the challenge with us, and because we want to have healthy extroverted intuition, which means that we, fold in its polarity opposite of introverted sensing or memory, because we want to fold that in. We become responsible to the things we say yes to. And once we say yes to something, you and I feel an obligation to commit to it and commit and try to finish strong if possible. That's another thing that's a motto here, is try to finish strong. We don't always do it. We're not always good at it.
No, take the tryout. Finish strong.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Do or do not. There is no try, which is a very much an ENFP thing to say. I don't necessarily agree with it, but
100%, that's accurate.
Yeah. And at the same time, we feel like there's a sense of obligation or commitment that comes along with saying yes to things. And I think that's why really healthy exploration or extroverted intuition, really healthy versions of it, get good at vetting what's a good pattern, what's a good opportunity, what road to go down. Because once it's there, it feels like it's stuck, right? It's like it's committed, and now it has to see it through. And if you say yes to something that was not a good thing to commit to, then now years of your life can be folded into whatever you said yes to that you shouldn't have. And I think that's why when I look at the world and how novelty obsessed we are, the thing that surprises me is you can tell that this is not a healthy extroverted intuition expression of novelty chasing, because we drop things as fast as we pick them up. There is no sense of commitment in this novelty. There's no sense of, like, once it stops being shiny or interesting, we just immediately toss it aside and we go for the next thing. Like, I think about, maybe this is not a great example. It just came to me, so I'm going to say it anyway. But I think about my smartphone. I have kept my phone, like, once I buy a new phone, I usually buy an iPhone, right? Because everybody in my world has an iPhone, so it's just easy to do that. And I'm used to them, and so I just keep buying iPhones. And I'm wondering if that's not like a great, like when Steve Jobs was around, I was like, yes, this is always going to work out for me. Now I'm like, I'm not so sure, because I have an earlier iteration of one. And the reason why I have an earlier iteration of one, it's still with a headphone jack and stuff. I think I have like a 6 or something, which is like 4 or 5 iterations past. And the reason why is because I don't want to get rid of it until it's dead. I keep my phones until they're dead, because I don't think standing in line to get the next iteration of a technology that's perfectly valid, like I can still use it until for some reason they will not allow me to update the operating system. I'm going to keep this piece of technology because I think it's irresponsible to sell it or to get rid of it and have this piece of technology just out there, like this actual physical, tangible thing that's filled with toxins and pollutants and that was made by the tiny hands of children in other countries, right? It's all kind of awful when we think about smartphones. It's awful when we think about smartphones, how they're created, what kind of toxins they put in the environment, and the fact that we race out to grab a new one as soon as it exists. To me, that is incredibly irresponsible extroverted intuition. And when I say the phrase "made by tiny hands in other countries," Joel just gave me like this like face of disturbance. Like I'm going to say that on a podcast, and that's horrible. But quite honestly,
I'm not disagreeing with you. I had a cringe moment because I recognize what you said.
Well, and also because I'm saying that on the podcast, it's going to trigger somebody, right?
Sure.
And yet, of all the people I know that are like, shaking an angry fist at the sky about all the terrible things that we implement in our world.
They're usually typing it out on an iPhone or an Android phone.
They are putting it in their smartphones. That's right.
That's where they're railing against all the problems of the world, yeah.
Exactly. And it's like, where exactly do you think that smartphone was made? Like on the backs of whose labor was that smartphone made? And so when I look at some of this novelty, I go, there is a level of irresponsibility that's woven into this. And how do we address that, right? How do we make sure that that's acknowledged? And so I think really good extroverted intuition or exploration always comes with it a sense of responsibility. Now, I'm still buying my iPhone, so am I really being responsible? I don't know. Right. And do I not have a smartphone like the rest of the planet? And I don't, because my entire world is digital. Like we do a podcast, we record a video for online distribution. We do social media in order to keep our brand going. Like literally everything in my world requires really good technology. And so do I not have good technology because what do I do there? Do I stop being an influencer because I know that there's like a lot of irresponsibility that gets folded into all this? I know I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but here's the quandary. Here's the quandary in being novelty obsessed. This is it right here. This is the challenge of being novelty obsessed in a novelty obsessed world that kind of doesn't care whose backs we do all of this labor on, as long as I get, gimme my smartphone. And I think that's why we need good extroverted intuition, because good extroverted intuition remembers, again, it's the patterns behind it. It remembers what goes into all of these things. It's not just dancing hamsters for dancing hamsters' sake in a car commercial. It's actual, what's the pattern of what's going on here? What's the etymology of what's happening here? What is the connections of all of these things? How is everything connected together? And do we want to go down this road? Do we want to go down this path if all of the connections around it are not responsible? If we don't want to obligate ourselves to that course of action, and the more sophisticated the extroverted intuition is, the more likely it is to take all of those into consideration.
I think one of the things that extroverted intuition can do, like you're saying, is help us know the novelty to say no to, the novelty to say yes to, as a gestalt. Like people that are thinking these ways and can use this function. And I also want to ensure that we talk about the positive principle-based stuff that extroverted intuition brings to our world, and not be too negative or too pinning it down into a box.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Because to be fair, it's probably extroverted intuition that created all those or helped create all that technology in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I think extroverted intuition does as a principle is it brings what-if thinking to our world. It brings possibility thinking to ruts of thought. Your brain, your way of life, the way we do things tends to get into certain patterns, and then new people come along and invent new ways of doing things. Instantly, the one thought came to mind, and I don't remember the details of this. So this is an anecdotal story I saw somewhere like on a History Channel like 20 years ago. But I was watching the history of sports and the high jump in the Olympics, where you grab like the pole jump, where you run with the pole and you jump over a bar. You know, you plant the pole in the ground and it springs you up over the bar. It used to be, I think this report said, you used to jump over it forward, going forward. And one time an athlete said he just went and decided to be quirky about it. I think it was a dude. I think it was a guy, yeah. And he just went and he like decided to go backward over it. And he realized he'd get higher over if he did it backwards. And it revolutionized the sport to where everybody today now does it reverse. They don't fly over the pole forward. They actually flip and turn backwards and fling themselves. You know how you've seen them kind of go over, they arch their back. And it's a way almost like in the air, aerial limbo to go up over top of the bar. And someone just randomly tried that one time. And now that's the standard of how the high jump is, or the pole vault. The pole vault? Is that, I don't even know the term of this. This is an extroverted intuitive moment I'm having actually right now on the air, as something struck me. A connection was made in my brain as we're talking, and I'm trying to remember the introverted sensing details of it to make my point of a pattern I remember thinking about. This is what extroverted intuition does, right? It pulls something, random piece of information that I had in my brain, and then just connected a reason for it, or a reason to talk about it, a narrative around it, and now I'm expressing it to you while you're listening to us, trying to communicate an idea, and it's just this pattern that was formed in real time. So this is what extroverted intuition can do. It can give us possibility thinking, give us new ways of trying things that might be better than the old ways of trying things. And unless you try them, and maybe sometimes fail, maybe fail a lot, and cycle through a bunch of those, you're never going to find something that works new or better than what you did before. That's another key, though, I think this is one thing our culture forgets in the sense of trying new things. You have to understand most of them are going to fail. And I think our culture expects things to, maybe not technology work. I think we're all used to calls being dropped on our phones and websites being broken and bugs and things not being updated in apps and all that. But it is something to be said for, like, when we try something new socially or try something new culturally or even technologically or business-wise, most of those things aren't going to go anywhere. Most of the possibilities we're playing with are going to fizzle out, or they're not going to be the right thing yet. They have to be calibrated and tried again. Most of it's just a bunch of waste, right? Wasted effort and energy. This is why extroverted intuitive people typically burn a lot of energy, because you almost have to be able to try so many things all the time. So that's something else is we have to realize as a culture that if we're going to have this novelty and we want to make our way through it, most of the things that are novel are going to just fizzle out and not work and not be something we can actually rely upon.
Yeah. So here's where I say things where it sounds like I contradicted what I said before. So
I love it.
Yeah. And by the way, whenever a function is done well, it appears to be a contradiction, because the principle of life is almost everything loops back on itself. Like extroverted feeling or harmony.
Like the law of paradox, basically.
Yeah, effectively. It's like the law of paradox. In order to be exceptional with harmony, you have to get good with conflict, right? Because harmony only is birthed from real, honest, authentic conflict resolution. So you have to master conflict to master harmony. In order to build things and be extraordinary at building things with extroverted thinking, you have to get good at destroying. This is like the whole concept of the Indian gods of Shakti and Shiva, right? The creator cannot come through unless the destroyer has first paved a way. And so you have to get good at breaking things down in order to build up good systems. It's just how everything works. And with extroverted intuition, I mentioned before, it's like it's really good at knowing what to say yes to. Well, that's not necessarily true. It's gotten better over time at seeing patterns of what to say yes and no to, because it spent so much time spinning its wheels and throwing spaghetti against the wall and burning energy and waste. It's done all of that for so long, it finally gets an instinct for which direction to go and which direction not to go. And it gets an instinct for what's responsible and what's not responsible. But it got there through... It got through the fail again, fail better principle. Like Samuel Beckett's quote that I'm constantly quoting. I don't think I've quoted it in a while on the podcast, so maybe it'll sound fresh. But I quote it all the time in all our programs. And it's the Samuel Beckett quote of, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. It's like one of my favorite. It just speaks to my extroverted intuition like crazy. And because extroverted intuition or exploration is it just naturally understands that principle, it gives a lot of space for failure. I think it's one of the things it does the best, is it gives a ton of space for failure. Maybe not in itself if we're really hard on ourselves, but that's just our job. That's our garbage. That's our baggage. The function itself is not making any judgments. The function itself is good at holding space for failure, for attempts, right? That's why I said, do or do not. There is no try. It's like it's a way, and I said it was an ENFP quote, and I think it's because it's a way for an ENFP to try to get out of the rut of just trying stuff over and over and try to sort of force itself into this place of success with its extroverted thinking, right? It's like, no quarter. But the reality of the situation is that you always are trying. It's always a try. If I looked at Yoda, I was like, that's a silly phrase because it's always trying, and maybe you'll succeed this time and maybe you won't.
Take that, George Lucas.
That's right.
You're always trying, even with episode 1 through 3. It was you tried, buddy. You tried.
You tried. Particularly episode 1. You tried. So the reason why I mention all that is we're in a time period right now where we don't give anybody quarter for anything. That's not an E-prime statement. Obviously, that's an exaggeration. Lots of people are holding space for a lot of other people. And also, I think right now we're in such a time period of, oh, you did one thing wrong one time 20 years ago, and combing through your records, I was able to find that, or longer ago. Like, you did one thing that we don't approve of now 40 years ago, and now we can use that dirt against you right now to try to paint your character as a certain way, even though this thing happened decades ago in an earlier incarnation or iteration of who you were. We don't give any space for growth or development. We don't give any space for the changing times of, greater social awareness or consciousness. You just did this thing a really long time ago, and you have to answer for it now, and now we're going to destroy you over it. So to me, that's, I cannot think of a stupider way of looking at reality. Like, it's literally the stupidest thing I can think of. And I'll tell you why I think it's so profoundly stupid. I'm going to get passionate about this.
Uh-oh, here we go.
The reason why it's so profoundly stupid is that's how we learn. That's how we learn. And if we teach people to never, ever, ever, like if we teach people that we're going to comb through every mistake they've ever made throughout their entire history, and we're going to use it examples to assassinate their character now, all we'll do is teach people not to do anything ever. That's it. We're just going to teach people to never do or say anything ever. And then we will atrophy as a species because we learn through extroverted intuition. We learn as little kids. I think all little kids are little NPs and SPs, right? All of us are daredevils, and all of us are learning through, just test, iterate. It's how we learn everything. And because of that, because from the time we're tiny, we're learning by trying. There's a part of us, no matter what your personality type, there's a part of you that remembers that you learned the most valuable lessons of your life through failure, through trying it. And when it didn't pan out, you tried it again, and you tried it again, and eventually you succeeded. Riding bikes, figuring out what it is you like to eat and what you don't like to eat, figuring out the kind of person you should be hanging around with, right? Your ideal friends or pair bond partners or whatever it is. The kind of job you want, right? The things that are funny and aren't funny. What kind of audience you should be saying things in front of, right? Like who you are as a human being has been birthed from a series of trial and error. And if we don't give people space to do that, we're going to have a homogenized, milquetoast, like absolutely terrified population.
I think that's on purpose, though, Antonia.
Yeah, no kidding, right?
I mean, the idea of ensuring people don't, first of all, if you zoom, so on a local level, what you're talking about, it's a great way to control people, to ensure that you punish any possible mistakes, right? That's one of the things you can do to put the fear of God in them, that they're not going to make any mistakes now. And it keeps everybody homeostasis and calm. So you can control large groups of people if you make them fear shame or public censure. So it's a control tactic. It's also a power grab tactic in some ways. But if you don't zoom in so much, just zoom out for a minute. One of the things we started this podcast off is talking about how the world's overrun with novelty. And so if you zoom out far enough and just detach any narratives or any political things or anything else from it, just zoom out almost energetically, meta level, it might be just a reaction against how much novelty we have in our world. It's almost like a giant energetic throttle against just random arbitrary novelty to say, like almost like we're going to punish things that we look and we have narratives why it's bad and wrong in the past, mistakes that were made. And again, there's some mistakes that were made that do need to be dealt with. Like they were part of this people's character or a cultural character that we have to root out. We can't keep bad stuff going on in perpetuity.
Yeah, well, I'm not talking about finding bodies in somebody's backyard.
Yeah, so I mean, somebody was a serial killer 30, 40 years ago. Maybe they're reformed now and they haven't killed anybody the last 10 years, but there's still some accountability to that, right?
Totally, absolutely.
And that's on an individual level, a cultural, societal level, a political level. Like there's things that we have to look at in that way. And I think we take them individually, case by case. But I do think maybe energetically there's a pushback against just the random novelty. And it's not a very good pushback. It's uncalibrated. It's a punishing pushback, which I don't appreciate. But again, if you just detach from the narrative and look at it, that's kind of like on a giant gestalt level, that seems to be maybe a calibration that's happening in mass because there's not a lot of religious dogma or political restraints. People are very free in our Western world to pretty much act, as long as they don't break the law, act any way they want. Sometimes that's rude. Sometimes that's hostile. Sometimes it's marginalizing other people. Sometimes it's just being wild and random and arbitrary for its own sake. I mean, I think the universe is punishing these kids that are leaning off the side of trains to take Instagram pictures or leaning off the side of cliffs to get the novelty picture they want. Sometimes they're falling to their death. Did you think through what you were doing there? But it's almost like, hey, novelty's okay to a degree, and then reality is going to smack you at some point. And maybe this is just energetically zoomed out. There's like a smacking of reality to calibrate this or throttle it in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's like the paradox. It's the paradox of we're in a novelty time period. I think we're in an extroverted intuition time period without bringing the extroverted intuition acumen. And the combination of those two things is generally disaster. It effectively is anarchy. That's what it is. If extroverted intuition was able to run wild and do whatever it wanted to without any throttles or without any values, right? Value systems helping align it or calibrate it. That is effectively what it is. It's anarchy. And I'm not an advocate of anarchy. I don't think it's I have a little bit too much introverted sensing in me to believe that anarchy is the right way to go. And at the same time, because we're in this time period of novelty without the lessons that a lifetime of using extroverted intuition as a dominant or an auxiliary function or a driver co-pilot, a lifetime of all of the lessons that come from doing it thoughtfully, I think that's why you get, like you mentioned, these energetic throttles. I mean, I called it stupid, and I do think it's stupid. I think it's stupid in the sense that I think it's thoughtless.
Well, there's narratives you might think are stupid that it's attached itself to. On the local level. Like if you zoom in, there's maybe like reasons why people are doing things, and it's like, that's stupid. But the throttling it's understandable.
Even energetically, I think punishing is not a smart way of going.
I agree.
But I think forms of throttling are a smart way of going about it.
Discipline and calibration is better than punishment, always.
That's exactly it. Discipline and calibration is always better. And there's a difference between punishment and discipline, right? Like even like the word discipline comes from the word disciple, right? Which is learning. And basically it's like a form of calibration, right? It's like a disciple, somebody who followed someone else to try to, figure out the best way to manifest their best self, right? Or like a way to manifest their best self. Discipline is always about refinement. Punishing, I mean, a person can never learn a lesson and be punished.
It's built on a debt structure. There's a debt owed. Now you got to owe this debt. It's punitive.
It's punitive, exactly.
Yeah.
Punitive versus disciple. That's effectively it. So to me, punishing is not that is not the good way to go when it comes to trying to throttle a novelty time period or extroverted intuition time period. Discipline absolutely is. Now, of course, that goes down the road of conversations like as ENPs, we're always talking about develop your co-pilot and introverted feeling, authenticity, or introverted thinking accuracy to make sure you're doing your own personal throttling. But how do we infuse that concept into the public consciousness so that as it's going through this ocean of novelty, it can bring along some of the sophistication that NPs have by a lifetime of doing this. And I think that's one of the reasons why exploration or extroverted intuition, for those of us who use it well, is or the healthiest expressions are so important, because it reminds us that I don't think novelty is going anywhere, by the way. I think we're in a fully NP time period right now, and I don't really see, the laws of technology are not going to change, right? What it was, not Moore's law. Is it Moore's law every 8
I think
months?
So.
Technology changes dramatically, or like anyway, that's not going anywhere. It's not like we're going to slow down in our technological advancement unless there's like a compelling reason, resource wise or whatever. But we're not really going to be slowing down in our technological advancement. It's only going to speed up. And that means that the world is only going to get more complicated, and it's only going to get more tied together, and it's only going to be a bigger and bigger, more complex spider web of interconnected humans and thoughts and concepts and stuff and resources and all that. It's only going to get more that direction. So I think that those of us who are using this function need to be showing up as people who use it well. We need to be symbols of what it can look like. And that means that we're not going to necessarily be novelty chasers, not in the way that most people think about it. We love novelty and we like new creations and invention, but we aren't novelty chasers like other people, like sometimes it looks like, or one would think we would be. Like I said, I still have an iPhone 6, right? I've had it for years and years and years, and I'll have it until it dies or until I can't update the operating system anymore. Why? Because I don't need anything new. Right? That's not a novelty I need to be chasing. It's suiting my purposes just fine. I'd rather put my novelty seeking in more creative space of trying to figure out what are the most sophisticated solutions to these extraordinarily sophisticated challenges that we're experiencing on the planet. Let's apply our creativity and our novelty towards problem solving, shall we? As opposed to just consuming. And so I think that's what it is right now we're in a consumptive novelty chasing time period. But when you're using extroverted intuition or exploration, it's not necessarily consumptive. In fact, it's productive. We end up producing things that other people consume. So as we are producing things, as really high quality extroverted intuition produces things that other people consume, let's embed in there these concepts of how to do that responsibly, how to do that well, how to make sure we're integrating that polarity opposite of introverted sensing or memory, some responsibility, some obligation, some making sure that, we're seeing things through. And at the same time, giving plenty of space for mistakes and ways to forgive and ways to go, well, that's just what that person was dealing with during that time period. That's just what they were going through at that time period. Is this something that necessarily says something about them as a human being, or are we doing that to them because we're trying to energetically throttle, like you mentioned, Joel, which I think was a friggin' brilliant point, by the way, that we're trying to energetically throttle this time period of novelty? Are we just scared of it? Are we exploiting this for our own purposes? Are we applying our narratives onto this? Or are we unsure of how to throttle this energy of novelty? And so we're arbitrarily applying our own senses of throttle to this. I think these are really complex thoughts that deserve some serious consideration. And I think those of us who use this function may be some of the most qualified to try to figure out those answers.
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of reading this really amazing book, Disney War, which is talking about the Walt Disney Company and how Michael Eisner came into it in 1984 and stayed there till 2005. And there's all these changes in the Walt Disney Company. It's just an interesting, kind of peek into a corporation that I really respect and like a lot. And I'm getting a lot of insights and understanding here. And one of the things I'm listening to right now, the chapter I'm in listening to, is talking about how the Walt Disney Company bought ABC Television here in the United States. And they're talking about programming these television channels and some different networks they bought. And it occurred to me as you were talking about this idea of novelty, the book's talking about the programming people at the channels, trying to program different ideas and new shows and all this. And as you were talking, Antonia, about novelty, I realized in our current world right now, many of us are channel programmers. Many people have an Instagram account, a Twitter account, Facebook account. They're attempting to generate content, and they need to program their channel with some kind of content, some kind of information, something interesting, something people will look at. And most people that are using these platforms typically are not diving into a topic. Now, many are. I'm connected to some that are, and we are here at PH. But often they're looking for content in the form of novelty. Well, I'll fill my channel with something new and shiny as a way to fill in content rather than sticking with one topic or something like that. Like my children watch this show called Good Mythical Morning on YouTube, and they're constantly doing like challenges like which peanut butter tastes smoother and like which hairspray does this thing. And I mean, just random like product tests, random like novelty things. They're always trying to like figure how things taste, and they're done. And it's very, I think they're probably both NPs that do this show, but it's a constant chase for novelty, and the content is built around the next novelty thing instead of like a topic or topics that they dive deep on and talk about and unpack and get really deep into. And I think that's the other thing that we have to see here is that extroverted intuition can be just that shiny chasing, but it also would lend us to be able to go deeper and make more connections on the things we already know about. So we are a world of brand new, it's almost like everybody just got their own TV network or TV channel in the form of Instagram, Twitter, and all the channels that they're managing. And now they're like, I got to fill this with something. I have to basically fill this channel with something because this channel shows the world my value. Like the value of people attuning to me, how many followers and likes, Instagram attention, Twitter attention, all this stuff, how many times I'm mentioned, that's my value in the new world we're creating. The new social currency is my value on these social channels. And a lot of people attune themselves to the novelty rather than the depth of understanding, unpacking ideas. So I think we're only going to experience more of this pull as we go forward. There's going to be more and more and more of it. I just saw an advertisement yesterday on some random website that said, do you want to become an influencer? And I clicked on it because I'm into marketing, so I want to see what their marketing was. And they were like, for $57, I'll show you how to make an Instagram account, be an influencer, and figure out content you can put out. And, you could get brands to sponsor you, and this could be your career. And I'm like, whoa, this is crazy. Like, people are now teaching this to others. So this is going to be like a massive thing. It's going to get more and more and more on people's radar. And most people, like most YouTube channels are struggling. Most Instagram accounts are struggling for content. So I think this is where that novelty comes from. And I think that some of the throttling that we're seeing is probably also trying to manage this up and down of that, because that's going to be something on the social scene in our world. So I just wanted to bring that to light as something that I think was coming up for me as you were talking.
Yeah. Not to talk crap about Good Mythical Morning. It's an entertaining show, and there's a place for entertainment. And also, I agree. I think that there's for those of us who use extroverted intuition or exploration, we have a unique opportunity to apply something that the world is right now trying to reconcile. Like, it's trying to figure out this thing of how to balance these energies. We have an opportunity. I wouldn't say we have a responsibility, but we have an opportunity to be examples of what that can look like by applying that creative energy into something that's got more of a through line, like something that's more complex, maybe something more thoughtful, something that has more of a through line. I totally agree with that. The other word that came up for me as you were talking was the word curiosity. And it may be because I like I said earlier in the podcast, I was like, okay, this is when I start contradicting myself. And the reason why is because I have a complex relationship with this function because it's my dominant function. So it's where I swim. It's like I'm a fish in water. It's everything to me. So I see all the complexities of it from the inside. And I think that one of the things that extroverted intuition reminds the world, as you were talking earlier about all the positives it brings and the principled positives it brings, one of the things it brings is curiosity. It doesn't leap to conclusions very quick. In fact, that's sort of its magic. Its magic is that it wants to get quick patterns, but it does it by being insatiably curious. And so when something gets thrown at it, when an assumption gets thrown, or like I talked about before, like this idea that I think it's stupid to, to have no capacity for forgiveness, right? And because somebody did something a million years ago. What extroverted intuition teaches people is to stay curious about it. Okay, so somebody did something 40 years ago, or this company did this thing that seems offensive, or this human being did something that appears offensive, or I did something that I'm not proud of a long time ago, or even yesterday, right? Like there's a lot of things to be able to apply a judgment on very quickly and shut the book, right? Bang the gavel and it's over. Extroverted intuition teaches people or reminds them that there's usually more going on to the story, so be curious about the whole thing. What actually happened here? What's the system of what's going on?
Lots of possibilities.
Yeah, there's a million different reasons why that could have happened. I have a very somebody in my life who's a loved one, I'm extremely fond of, who's going through a case right now where if you look at it through one lens, it appears as if they're the worst human being on the planet. That they're protecting evil people.
Well, through the media's lens.
Yeah, through the media's lens, it would be like, this is the worst human being ever. But I know the story, right? I got curious and I went, hey, what actually happened here? And because I got curious and heard all of the elements of the situation, I went, oh, this is literally the opposite of what it's being said. It is literally the opposite of what they're being accused of. Like literally the opposite is 180 degrees away from what the quote unquote official story is. And I suspect that happens all the time. Anytime, I guess it's actually this weird optimism of my extroverted intuition has actually made me relatively cynical about stories and narratives that are thrown at me. Anytime I read anything, I just go, you know what? I'm definitely not getting the whole story here. I am definitely not getting the whole story. And if I actually want to know what's going on here, I'm going to have to dig deep in. And if I don't have time to do that, instead of going, well, I guess I got to make some sort of judgment on this, instead of doing that, I go, I'm not applying the time and energy to hearing, like to investigating the full story here. So I'm going to reserve judgment. Like my seal of approval or disapproval is not necessary right now. Like I don't have to do that. I do not have to apply judgment. I can just stay curious and just kind of hold it openly. And that's, I believe, a component that must come along with this novelty-seeking time period. You have to stay curious. If you're gonna love novelty, you got to stay curious. They walk hand in hand with each other. And that's not to say that you never make a decision on anything or you never make a judgment call. Obviously, that would not be a healthy human being. But you don't do it if you don't think that you have a full picture. Extroverted intuition wants a full picture. It wants all the little connections. It wants all the pieces of information. It wants to know more about it. That's why it blazes a trail in the first place. It blazes a trail because it wants to see what's on the rest of the island. It doesn't want to just make any assumptions about the island where it got beached, right? It wants to go, well, what else is here? So it starts blazing trails in order to see a bigger picture, to be able to zoom out and take in a full territory. So if we're going to be in a novelty-seeking time period, we also have to be in a curiosity time period. Truly curious, like radically curious. And if we can teach people, those of us who are using this function and using it well by also embedding into it a sense of responsibility, right, with that polarity opposite of introverted sensing, if we can be basically avatars of curiosity, avatars of seeing a bigger picture and a full picture. I think that we can really actually impact change just by being us, by just showing up and showing what it looks like to not make those quick judgment calls.
I think something else at a principle level that extroverted intuition can bring us is a speed of information and learning. Like the connection pieces are so fast. So like I tend to read biographies and like novels, like fiction, which I don't read very much anymore, but I read those through. But most like nonfiction books, like business books, I've gotten to the place where my extroverted intuition has picked up the pattern in the books enough. Most books start off like there's chapters. It's very well, like most books are getting more and more organized as they go. And most books have like a Stephen Covey book has like a lot of examples and stories, and a lot of people like those and appreciate those stories, I skip right past them. I go to like the bullet points, and I could get through a book in probably a couple hours. I'll go into Barnes & Noble, pick up 2 or 3 nonfiction books. I don't actually speed read them, but I go through and I get enough of the details. I'll make a couple notes in a notebook, and I'll just pick up some of the highlights, some of the main points, some of the main keys, the summaries at the end of the chapters, and I'll get a gist of the book without having to spend an entire like day or two reading that book. So my extrovert intuition allows me to pattern things rapidly, and the more I spend time with business books, marketing books, and things, I start to see multiple patterns emerge through multiple books. So I'm starting to put together some of my own learning and understanding through that. So I think extrovert intuition brings that to my threshold, brings that to my doorstep, the ability to do that. Now, the challenge with that is there's a threshold here. It has to be balanced with depth of knowledge. So I miss a lot of details in doing that. I get the bigger picture. I can move fast and I can learn fast, but I also know that sometimes I'm missing details and nuance and depth of understanding, like on a really core, gritty level. And that's been something that over the past 10, 15 years, I've been trying to really work back into my life to pay attention to those details to the point where, like, I'm reading, if I don't know how to pronounce a word, I never look it up. I just skim over it and I just keep moving on because I got the gist of what the person was trying to say. I don't need to know this word's pronunciation or spelling. And then sometimes that's come back to haunt me, right? Just skimming over stuff, especially if I'm reading out loud now and I don't know how to pronounce things. I'm like, oh crap, I don't know how to pronounce this word. But it's been such a slowdown for me to do that I've favored speed over the detail. I think being married to you and with you, Antonia, for the last 10 years, or the decade or so, has taught me to pay more attention to details. I know your introverted thinking does that more, right? You pay attention to the nuance of the data itself. And that's been very powerful for me, just also in maturity. But that speed of learning has to be counterbalanced with depth. And I also see a lot of ENPs in the world just going through their life in that speed of learning, moving so fast, and they're missing so much richness and depth that I've been like, wow, this is something we need to all slow down and pay attention to. And I think it's happening. I think as we mature, it just happens naturally. But that's something to just kind of watch out for if you're an extroverted, intuitive user.
That's another paradox, isn't it? We want to see the whole picture, but we zoom out so far that we miss some of the details, and so we're not seeing the whole picture.
Yeah.
So it becomes sort of it's an obligation to zoom in and zoom out. Zoom out, try to see the whole territory. Zoom in, try to catch the relevant details. Zoom out, see what the whole picture looks like once you have those relevant details. Zoom back in to see if you missed anything. And that zoom in, zoom out, I think, is super important for people who are using this function. And what keeps you zooming in and zooming out? Curiosity.
Yeah. I think the other piece that extroverted intuition brings us, because of the what-if thinking, it's constantly looking with that, especially if the curiosity connected like you're talking about, that what-if possibility thinking. I think it brings optimism to our lives on a personal level and on a societal level, on a bigger level. It shows us what's possible in the world. You know, it's the idea that, hey, what if we put a person on the moon? Like, could we do that as humans? Like, hey, what if we put telecommunication satellites into space? Hey, what if this? Hey, what if that? Hey, what if we could generate electricity just putting something underneath all the floorboards in every house in every country to where as we walk across our floor, we're generating the electricity or portions of electricity for the house just through our movements, right? Every movement we make, we build the doors in our house to generate electricity when we open them or close them. Like, what if we could create a world like that to where that's sustainable possibilities? So it gives this optimism to us.
Yeah, what if we could mine plastics, right, in the ocean or in landfills and turn them into bricks to make houses out of them, right, in third world countries? I mean, there's so many different possibilities. And that's the great thing about this function is applying it to problem solving. All of those what-if questions help us solve big problems because we're willing to have a go at it. We're willing to try it out. I think that's a really beautiful part of this function. And I think that optimism, it's almost pathological. You really get into your extroverted intuition, and it doesn't matter how crappy things get. You just, like, a part of you is just like, it's going to be okay. We'll figure it out. and there's a part of me that I cannot help but feel that way. It's like, oh, we're doing really poor financially right now. The whole company might sink. And I'm always like, oh, we'll be fine. We'll get through it. And we usually do. Well, we have up to this point, right? It doesn't matter how bad things get. Like, we always find a way to muscle through or do creative, quick problem solving, and we get our way through. And I think the energy that the function brings, the optimistic energy, is part of why it gets solved. It's not just the solutions we come up with. It's the energy we're applying behind the solutions, the energy of we can do this. the optimism and the ability to spot opportunities and the ability to do it with a positive energy that you put out to the world, I think the world actually rewards. The universe, I think, rewards optimism. It rewards that positivity. And so I think people who are NPs have a tendency to get rewarded by the people around them that just like that energy.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to the NPs in a minute, but we always want to talk a little bit about blending in the introverted sensing portion of this polarity, because we talk about the opposite each time. I start to wrap up and you're always like, well, wait, one more thing I want to talk about before you wrap up. So why don't you say that really quick about, you had some thoughts around weaving together introverted sensing as a balance, a counterweight to this, as a stability. Then I want to say a few comments to NPs in general, and then we can wrap up the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I think there was a couple things that I already mentioned, the concept of the through line, the concept of sticking with something, which you've said yes to it. I think another component to remind myself and those of us who are using this function and trying to use it well is to not abandon lessons from history, to make sure that we're looking to the past, our own personal experiences of the past, and just a general appreciation of the past, so that as we are optimistic and try to problem solve, we don't do it by thinking that we've invented this world. Like we didn't invent this world, we inherited this world. And most of the ideas that we have that are good ideas, we didn't invent those either. They've been in the collective unconscious for eons. Sometimes we are in a place where we have an opportunity to employ those thoughts and
or
ideas.
rediscover them, maybe.
We can rediscover them. We can now have the technology or the systems to be able to actually do them. But most of the ideas we have are not actually novel. They're not actually new. And so they're an emergent of a system that's probably been replicated a million times before. So whenever we have a solution or whenever we have a concept, to go back and comb through the past and look for examples of when it was done well, and look for examples of when it wasn't done well and how it could have been improved in those situations, and to not forget that there are rich histories and traditions of doing things that should be feeding into our current problem solving, because the world is extremely different than it ever has been before, but also it's very much the same as it has been before too. like we it's that idea that what all human beings share the overwhelming majority of our DNA with each other, but we'll look so different from each other. We'll look so different, but the reality is that we're mostly the same.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the modern world too. Like we love novelty because we have tricked ourselves into believing that this is all brand new. Every moment we blink, it's a brand new world. And the truth of the situation is that there's very few, if no, new ideas. So make sure that we are honoring the past. Make sure that we're honoring the things that we've seen come before us, and comb through history for its lessons. And the more we do that, the higher quality those of us who are NPs, the higher quality our extroverted intuition solutions are.
So that's actually dovetails into what I want to talk about. And I'll start by saying, if you look at this as a polarity, extroverted intuition is paired with introverted sensing. These are both perceiving functions. And the other perceiving polarity is introverted intuition and extroverted sensing. And if we look at the extroverted sensing, introverted intuition, and we've talked about this, I think, on the podcast before, if we look at that as the mind-body connection, the introverted intuition, extroverted sensing, there's the mind-body, the physical body with the mind and the perceptions and the perspectives and the here and now, and all this is woven together. If we look at the extroverted intuition with introverted sensing, what we're talking about today, that extroverted intuition process, NE or exploration, we've nicknamed it here. It seems to be, this isn't focused on mind-body as much. This is focused almost on the abstract systems around us. The procedures, the systems, the legacies, and then the novelty and new things that are built off of those platforms and things that have come before. So I want to just focus us in on this for a second, particularly if you're an NP in the Myers-Briggs system, because this is, you use extroverted intuition and you pair that in your back seat of your car or lower down on your cognitive function stack with introverted sensing. And it's important for us to remember as NPs that we're building everything off of something that came before, that introverted sensing part of us, like what Antonia just referenced. And that's not just in the systems and structures, not just the pyramids in Egypt that were we've gotten inherited as a legacy of structural things. We also have social things we've inherited, certain religious ideas of maybe forgiveness and love and things that now maybe aren't in the realm of religion, but we still have to deal with these ideas of forgiveness and love in some other way. Like, these are things we've discovered as humanity. And also, I would look at biology. Like, we come with hardwired things in our physicality, in our personhood, in the way we're wired. You know, if you look at the triune brain theory, the lizard brain of us, it's still there. It's still represented. There's hormones and things that drive us that, as novel as we want to get, we're still starting with some hardware as a baseline. So we have structure and hardware we're starting with, and we iterate off of that as NPs. And we have to remember that baseline's important, not to forget that we're starting from somewhere. We're not just in a completely blank slate laboratory. And I think extroverted intuition actually does better when it has building blocks of things that came before that it can find new patterns and connections with. It can move faster. It can make better connections and patterns when it has things to work with, when it starts with a foundation. So I would say think in terms of baseline and platform. Think in terms of hardware and what's been here before as we iterate and think of the novelty and curiosities of what comes next. And we have to honor that introverted sensing part, to your points, Antonia, of what's been there before. And if we're not honoring that, we're untethered and we're free-floating like random helium balloons in the sky that will hit the upper atmosphere and explode if we don't get some kind of throttle or some kind of containment for them. And I think that the second thing I wanted to say for NPs listening is that discipline is going to be key for us. This has been impactful in my life. Disciplining yourself using your introverted function. If you're an NP, you're going to either have introverted thinking or introverted feeling as a throttle point, what resonates and is authentic to you, or what makes sense and is with integrity for you, depending on which function you're using to counterbalance that extroverted intuition. It's also going to be a counterbalance to that, help us make better decisions of what's important, what makes sense, and what resonates. And as we discipline this, remember, everyone else is not going to necessarily show up having the best use of extroverted intuition because that's not their strength. But us NPs have the ability to discipline ourselves and the way we think and the way we go through the world with our extroverted intuition. And the world's not going to help us discipline this. It's going to want us to just be as free form as possible. But if we can bring it under correct discipline, and I don't mean discipline like disciplining children, I mean personal discipline, like framing things in your mind, saying no to stuff, because stuff you say no to will probably be more impactful for you as an NP than what you say yes to, because you're so used to saying yes to so many things. And this is what I think can really help us as NPs, as we need extroverted intuition in our world. It shouldn't go anywhere, but we need people that are driving it, that know how to drive that vehicle, that know what they're doing, that won't crash us into something and chase novelty for novelty's sake. Help us see how novelty, new thinking possibilities, and curiosity can be beneficial for us, and also referencing the things that have come before, because that has to be woven into the messaging. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It will destroy us as a culture, as a society, as a world. We have to have those two things blended together. I think the world needs extroverted intuition, just like it needs all the functions. I think each of these functions have a place in our world. And as we move forward, we talked about introverted intuition in a few podcasts ago. And I want to speak to intuition in general. The world is getting more complex. The problems are getting more nuanced, complex. We need more possibility, optimistic thinking. We need both forms of intuition represented, and we need extroverted intuition represented. It's going to help us make the patterns and connections we have to make, because we can't know how the future is going to go. We have to make guesses about it. We have to. Things are just too big, too fast, and too complex in order not to. So by disciplining yourself as an NP, and I'm doing this too, and Antonia's doing this too, we are going to be able to show up and give the world the best version of ourselves to contribute with our intuition, our extroverted intuition, giving the world what I think it needs, which is that function. So what do you think? You've been listening with us. I just went on this diatribe, this like sermon on the podcast, not on the mount, sermon on the podcast. What are your thoughts? We want to hear your questions, your comments. We want to hear your story, quite frankly. Come over to personalityhacker.com, directly below the show. Engage with the discussion that's going to be ongoing around this content, around what we just talked about here. Let's keep this conversation going. Let's expand on it. What have you noticed about extroverted intuition? Where is it useful in your life? Have you seen yourself be undisciplined around it? Have you been very disciplined with it? Is it something somebody in your life has that you appreciate or it drives you crazy? We want your personal story. So you can do that over at personalityhacker.com. Directly below this show, come over and do that as soon as you can.
I think we should start a second podcast and call it Sermon on the Podcast.
Okay.
I think it's a good idea. Or maybe it's a terrible idea. I don't know. That's an extroverted intuition moment. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, various Android platforms, and Spotify. And if you do not have a copy of our book, you need 11 copies, as we have previously mentioned, for the zombie apocalypse. So get thee to buying 11 copies of our book. Or if you don't think the zombie apocalypse is coming, just get 1 or 2, or just 3 or 4, or half a dozen.
If you're a new listener, we referenced that these are very useful to burn for fuel, for stacking on things, door stoppers, or giving to people to rebuild society after the zombie apocalypse is over, so we all know how each other can get along.
Guys, it could become the new Bible.
Which is really what I think you should do, is give it to friends, buy 11 copies and give them away.
That's right. It's a sermon on the podcast, and that will be the new world post-zombie apocalypse Bible. So, and also you can hide things in it. We also mentioned that too. Anyway, go get yourself a copy of the book. It's at Amazon, Books A Million, tons of other retailers, and it's a good one. So go get yourself at least one. Is that all I say? Or do I say more stuff?
I think our list is ever evolving, but basically, if you like this podcast, you talk about leaving a review on iTunes.
Yes. Okay. All you had to say is review. So if you enjoy the podcast, you can also leave us a rating and review on iTunes, and that also helps us out a lot. And I read everyone. I'm obsessed. So if you want to send me a personal message, don't do it there, but I will read the review.
I wish you wouldn't say that on here.
I know.
Because I want it to be a legitimate review.
I know, me too. And also, one time, a long time ago, I said, and I read all the 1-star ones, and I saw somebody had a 5-star, said something really positive about us, and the last time after I made that podcast comment, I went back and was reading the podcast comments or reviews again, and they made it a 1-star.
I've actually stopped reading any negative comments, not because I don't want to hear feedback, but I figure people close to me will give me accurate feedback. So if it's a 1-star, I don't read it anymore. But 5 stars I do, and 4 stars and 3 stars.
Ooh, yeah, I should.
2 and 1s, I'm like, I don't want to get that in my head and worry about it or get a negative thing going.
That's true.
Because you obsess about negative comments or down comments more than positive ones, and I want to obsess about the positive stuff and remember what impact we're having to keep going on this.
Well, and so often I read them and I'm like, I think this person was just having a bad day.
Of course.
I mean, it could just be, sometimes it's legit feedback that we need to hear. And other times I'm like, I think this person was just in a really bad mood.
Or it's confusing. They're like, your audio quality is terrible. It sounds like a blender. And I'm like, maybe you're on a different show because I think the audio is okay, but maybe, I don't know. I wish I could ask people to clarify. What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway.
So, I think I went through all my stuff.
I mean, if you legitimately hate this and you listen this far and you want to go give a 1-star, please feel free. I won't read it, but feel free. But if you leave a nice review, then I probably will see it at some point.
Okay, no more rambling. Let's land the plane.
Let's land the plane. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.